The Silent Child. The wind howled through the narrow streets as Pastor Greg walked home from his small church. His heart was still light with the warmth of the evening service, the words of faith and hope still lingering in his mind. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of distant rain, and the streetlights cast long, flickering shadows on the cracked pavement. His modest church stood at the edge of town, a beacon for those who had lost their way. And Pastor Greg, he had made it his life's mission to help the lost find their way back home, both spiritually and physically. As he turned a corner near an old grocery store, something made him stop. A small shape was huddled near a dumpster, curled up against the cold brick wall. He narrowed his eyes and stepped closer. His heart clenched when he realized it was a child, a little girl, no older than 5 or 6. Her clothes were tattered and far too thin for the chilly night, her small arms wrapped tightly around herself in a desperate attempt to stay warm. Her dark curls were matted, and her skin was covered in a thin layer of dirt. Pastor Greg took a slow, careful step forward, not wanting to startle her. "Hello there, sweetheart," he said softly. "Are you okay?" The girl flinched but didn't speak. Her large, deep brown eyes stared up at him, filled with something that made his stomach twist. Fear. Real, raw fear. He knelt in front of her, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "My name is Greg," he said gently. "I'm a pastor. You don't have to be scared. Can you tell me your name?" The girl hesitated, her lips parting slightly before she whispered, "And Nila." Pastor Greg smiled. "That's a beautiful name, Nila. Are you lost? Where are your parents?" She didn't answer. Instead, she hugged her knees tighter, as if she were trying to make herself disappear. Pastor Greg sighed, his heart heavy with concern. This child was alone, afraid, and clearly in need of help. He couldn't leave her here, not when the night was getting colder and danger lurked in every shadow. "Nila," he said softly, holding out his hand. "Would you like to come with me? I have a warm house, and I can give you some food. You'll be safe, I promise." The girl stared at his outstretched hand, her small fingers twitching as if unsure whether to take it. Pastor Greg held his breath. He knew how fragile trust could be, how a single wrong move could make her run. After a long, tense moment, Nila slowly reached out and placed her tiny, ice-cold hand in his. Relief flooded through him. "That's a brave girl," he murmured. A safe place. Pastor Greg's home wasn't large, but it was warm and inviting. The smell of cinnamon lingered in the air from a pie he had baked earlier that day, and the soft hum of a clock ticking in the background filled the silence. Nila stood just inside the doorway, her small body tense. Her wide eyes scanned the room as if expecting something bad to happen. "You're safe here," Pastor Greg assured her. "Would you like some food?" She hesitated but eventually nodded. He led her to the kitchen and quickly put together a bowl of warm soup with some bread. He placed the food in front of her and sat across the table, watching as she hesitated before taking a cautious bite. The moment the warm food touched her tongue, something in her changed. She ate faster, almost desperately, stuffing pieces of bread into her mouth as if she was afraid it would disappear. Pastor Greg felt a lump rise in his throat. How long had she gone without a proper meal? How many nights had she spent on the streets, cold and hungry? He didn't ask. Not yet. After she finished eating, he showed her the guest bedroom. It was small but cozy, with a neatly made bed covered in a soft quilt. Nila hesitated at the door, glancing up at him. "This is for you," he said. "You can stay here for as long as you need." She stood frozen for a moment. Then, without a word, she walked in and climbed onto the bed. Her tiny fingers clutched the edge of the blanket, but she didn't lie down. Pastor Greg leaned against the doorway, watching her. "Would you like me to leave the light on?" She gave a tiny nod. "Okay," he said gently. "I'll be in the next room if you need anything." He turned to leave, but just as he reached the door, her small voice stopped him. "Why?" He turned back, surprised. It was the first real word she had spoken to him aside from her name. Why? What, sweetheart? Her brown eyes met his. Why help me? Pastor Greg felt something tighten in his chest. He walked back to her bed and knelt so they were eye level. Because I believe that no one should be alone, he said simply, and because I think God put you in my path for a reason. She studied him for a moment before lowering her gaze. People don't help. His heart shattered. You've been through a lot, haven't you? He whispered. She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Pastor Greg reached out slowly and placed a gentle hand on her small shoulder. You don't have to be scared anymore, Neela, he said softly. You're not alone now. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she shifted under the blanket and lay down. Pastor Greg stood and walked to the door. He left it slightly open, so she wouldn't feel trapped. As he settled into his own room, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Who was Neela? Where had she come from? And what was she too afraid to say? Little did he know, the answer to that question would change everything. The words she couldn't say. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting warm golden streaks across the wooden table. Pastor Greg stood by the stove, carefully flipping pancakes. The comforting aroma of buttery batter filled the air, and the faint hum of the coffee maker added to the peaceful morning atmosphere. He glanced toward the hallway, where the guest bedroom door remained shut. He didn't want to rush Neela. After all, she had been through something that had left her afraid to speak, afraid to trust. A quiet shuffle of footsteps caught his attention. He turned just in time to see Neela peeking around the doorway, her small frame almost blending into the shadows. Good morning. Pastor Greg greeted her warmly. Did you sleep okay? Neela hesitated but nodded slightly. Come on in, sweetheart. I made pancakes. She took a few hesitant steps forward. Even though she had accepted his help the night before, her body still held tension, as if she expected something bad to happen at any moment. Greg noticed how she hugged her arms around herself, the way her eyes darted around the kitchen, mapping the exits. He had seen that kind of behavior before, children who had been through too much, who had learned the hard way that trust was dangerous. He gestured toward the table. You can sit wherever you like. Neela approached the chair but didn't sit right away. Instead, she watched as he placed a pancake onto a plate and set it in front of her. She stared at it. Greg frowned. Are you not hungry? She hesitated for a moment before shaking her head, but he didn't believe her. He sat down across from her, choosing his words carefully. You know, when I was little, my grandmother used to make pancakes for me. She said the first bite is the hardest because you have to decide if you want to trust the person who made it. Neela lifted her eyes to him, as if searching for something in his face. Greg picked up his fork and took a bite of his own pancake. See? Safe. I promise there's no secret ingredient like broccoli hidden inside. Something almost like amusement flickered across her face. After a few more seconds of hesitation, she picked up her fork and took a tiny bite. And just like the night before, something in her changed the moment she tasted the warm food. Her bites grew bigger, more eager. She finished her pancake quickly, and Greg casually placed another one on her plate without saying a word. As she ate, he decided to try again. Neela, do you remember where your parents are? She froze. Her whole body tensed, and her small hands gripped the fork so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Greg noticed the reaction immediately. He hadn't meant to scare her, but something about that question had struck a deep chord. It's okay, he said gently. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. She kept her head down, her jaw clenched. Greg sighed inwardly. He didn't want to push too hard, not when she was still so fragile. I was thinking, he continued after a pause, changing the subject. Would you like to come with me to the church today? You don't have to if you don't want to, but I have some books there. And some toys too. It might be fun. Neela lifted her gaze slightly, as if considering it. After a long pause, She gave the smallest nod. Whispers in the church. The church was quiet when they arrived. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the wooden pews. Neela stood just inside the doorway, her small fingers gripping the fabric of her sweater. She had never been in a place like this before. Greg knelt beside her, giving her a reassuring smile. "You're safe here. This is a good place." She didn't move. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the front. "I have something to show you." He led her to a small corner of the church, where a wooden bookshelf stood filled with children's books. Next to it was a toy chest, slightly worn but still in good shape. "You can pick anything you want," Greg said. For the first time since he had met her, something sparked in Neela's eyes. Curiosity. She hesitantly stepped forward and ran her small fingers over the books. Then, slowly, she pulled one out and sat on the floor, flipping through the pages. Greg didn't say anything. He simply sat beside her and watched as she ran her fingers over the pictures. Then, something surprising happened. She pointed at a picture in the book, a simple illustration of a family holding hands in a park. "Home," she whispered. Greg's breath caught. It was the first real word she had spoken to him since last night. He leaned in carefully. "Is that your home?" She hesitated. Then, slowly, she shook her head. Greg frowned. Then, "Is this what you want?" She stared at the picture for a long moment before nodding. Greg swallowed hard. This little girl had no home, no family, and she longed for one more than anything. He wanted to promise her that he would give her one, that he would keep her safe, but he knew that promises like that had to be made carefully. Instead, he reached over and pointed to another picture in the book. It was of a small girl standing alone, looking lost. "Neela," she whispered. Greg felt his heart clench. She was telling him something big. Before he could ask, she turned the page. This time, there was a picture of a girl holding someone's hand. She lifted her eyes to Greg, and in a voice barely above a whisper said, "Me." Greg felt something deep inside him shift. She was trying to tell him what she wanted. A home, a family, a hand to hold. And in that moment, Greg knew he wasn't going to let this little girl go back to the streets. She had no one. But now she had him. A frightening revelation. That night, as Greg tucked Neela into bed, he noticed something strange. As he pulled the blanket up to her shoulders, he caught a glimpse of something just beneath her sweater sleeve, dark bruises along her wrist. His breath caught. "Neela," he said softly, "what happened here?" She flinched and immediately yanked the blanket up to cover herself. Greg's heart pounded. "Neela." He tried again, his voice gentle. "Did someone hurt you?" She squeezed her eyes shut. Her small body trembled. And then, in a voice so soft he almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "Bad man." Greg's blood ran cold. His hands clenched at his sides as a wave of protectiveness surged through him. "Neela," he said, his voice shaking, "who is the bad man?" She didn't answer, but the terror in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. Someone had hurt her. And whoever it was, they were still out there. The secret she hid. The house was silent, but Pastor Greg lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. Who was the bad man? Neela had whispered those two words with such raw fear that it sent chills down his spine. He had seen bruises before. He had counseled struggling families, helped women and children escape dangerous situations. But he had never seen fear like the kind that flickered in Neela's eyes. He turned onto his side and closed his eyes. He needed to be patient. He couldn't force her to speak before she was ready. But one thing was certain, whoever had hurt her was still out there. And if they were looking for her, he needed to protect her. A disturbance in the night. A sudden sound jolted Pastor Greg from sleep. A muffled thump followed by a sharp whimper. His heart pounded. He threw off his blanket and rushed toward the hallway. Nyla's bedroom door was slightly open, and a faint light from the street lamp outside cast eerie shadows on the walls. He stepped inside. The bed was empty. "Nyla," he whispered, his chest tightening. A faint, ragged breath came from the far corner of the room. Greg's stomach dropped. She was curled up near the window, her tiny frame pressed against the wall. Her knees were drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was shaking. Greg crouched down, keeping his voice soft. "Nyla, sweetheart, what's wrong?" Her breath came in quick gasps, her chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven movements. Tears streaked her cheeks, and her eyes darted around wildly, as if searching for something or someone. She was having a panic attack. Greg stayed where he was, not wanting to overwhelm her. "You're safe, Nyla," he said gently. "You're in my house. No one can hurt you here." She shook her head violently, curling into herself even more. Greg hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached for the quilt from her bed and draped it over her shoulders. He didn't try to touch her. He knew better than that. But he sat next to her, his presence steady. They sat like that for what felt like hours. Eventually, her breathing slowed. The tremors in her hands faded. The terror in her eyes dulled just enough for her to blink up at him. Greg gave her a reassuring smile. "Do you want to talk about it?" She hesitated. Then, in a voice so quiet he barely heard it, she whispered, "He's coming." Greg's breath caught. "What?" Nyla's small hands gripped the blanket tightly. She shook her head. "He's looking for me." Greg's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about past abuse. Someone out there, someone dangerous, was actively looking for her, and she was terrified he would find her. Greg swallowed the lump in his throat. "Who, Nyla? Who is looking for you?" She hesitated, her lips pressing together. Then, in barely a whisper, she said, "My father." The name she feared. Pastor Greg's stomach twisted. He hadn't considered that. A father, but if she was afraid of him, something wasn't right. He forced himself to stay calm. "Can you tell me about him, sweetheart?" Nyla shook her head quickly. "He's bad." Greg studied her. Every part of her body screamed fear. This wasn't the normal nervousness of a lost child missing a parent. This was terror. Greg exhaled slowly. "Okay, you don't have to say anything else. But I promise you, he won't find you here." Her bottom lip trembled. "You don't know him," she whispered. Greg frowned. "What do you mean?" Nyla hesitated. Then, in a voice laced with fear, she whispered, "He always finds me." A chill crawled down Greg's spine. His instincts screamed that there was more to the story. But Nyla was exhausted. He could see it in her drooping eyes, the way her small body sagged under the weight of her fear. He placed a reassuring hand over hers. "You're safe here, Nyla. I won't let anything happen to you." She stared at him for a long time before finally, nodding. She didn't believe him. Not yet. But maybe, in time, she would. Seeking answers. The next morning, after making sure Nyla was settled with breakfast, Pastor Greg stepped outside onto his porch and pulled out his phone. He had to find out more about Nyla. And that meant contacting social services. "Hello, this is Pastor Greg," he said when the woman on the other end answered. "I have a situation with a child who may be in danger." After explaining everything he knew, the social worker, Sarah West, sighed on the other end. "That's troubling," she admitted. "Do you have any information about her last name? Where she came from?" Greg hesitated. "No, she barely speaks, but she told me she's afraid of her father." Sarah's voice grew serious. "That's not something to take lightly. If he's a threat, we need to report this to the authorities." Greg ran a hand over his face. "I just don't want to scare her any more than she already is." Sarah sighed. "I understand, but we need to at least file a missing child's report. If she has family looking for her, we need to know if they're safe or not." Greg's chest tightened. He knew she was right. "All right," he said. "Let's start there." The stranger watching. Later that day, as Greg and Neela walked back from the church, he felt it. A presence. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Someone was watching them. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the street. Nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. Greg's heart pounded. Was it just paranoia? Or was Neela right? Was someone looking for her? He gripped Neela's hand a little tighter, his protective instincts kicking in. They needed answers. And they needed them fast. Because if the wrong person found Neela first, she might not have a chance to escape again. The man in the shadows. The night was still. Too still. Pastor Greg sat in his small living room, the glow from a single lamp casting long shadows along the walls. His hands rested on his knees, but his muscles were tense. His instincts whispered what he didn't want to admit. Something wasn't right. After Neela had gone to bed, he had stepped outside onto the porch for some fresh air. And that's when he had felt it again. That unmistakable sensation. Someone was watching them. He had scanned the darkened street, eyes searching the alleyways and corners. But whoever they were careful. Hidden. Waiting. Greg had spent years counseling troubled souls. He knew fear, knew what it looked like. And Neela. Neela wasn't just scared. She was haunted. She didn't just fear her father. She feared what would happen when he found her. Greg rubbed a hand down his face, exhaustion gnawing at him. He couldn't sit idly by. He needed to act before it was too late. But where did he start? A sharp knock at the door shattered the silence. Greg's breath hitched. It was late. Too late for visitors. He stood, his heart pounding, and made his way to the door. He hesitated, then peeked through the peephole. A man stood on his porch. Tall, broad shoulders, dressed in dark clothes. And something about him sent a cold chill down Greg's spine. A stranger's questions. Greg swallowed hard before unlocking the door. He opened it just enough to see the man clearly, but not enough to invite him inside. "Can I help you?" Greg asked, his voice steady. The man's eyes were sharp, calculating. "I'm looking for someone," the man said, his voice deep and smooth. Greg's grip on the door tightened. The man pulled something from his pocket, a small, worn photo. He held it up. Greg's blood ran cold. It was a picture of Neela. Younger, maybe a year or two ago, but undeniably her. Greg forced his expression to remain neutral. "Who are you?" The man tucked the photo back into his pocket. "I'm her father." Greg's stomach twisted. This was him, the bad man. Neela's terror-filled whispers echoed in his head. "He always finds me." Greg's heartbeat thundered. He had to be careful, very careful. "Neela's not here," Greg lied smoothly. "I haven't seen her." The man's jaw tightened. For a moment, Greg thought he might call this bluff. But then the man nodded, stepping back slightly. "If you do," the man said, "you'll let me know, won't you, Pastor?" The way he said it made Greg's stomach churn. It wasn't a question. It was a warning. Greg forced a polite nod. "Of course." The man studied him for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. Greg watched him disappear into the night. Only when he was certain the man was gone did he finally allow himself to breathe. He shut the door and locked it. Then he sprinted up the stairs. The truth comes out. Neela was sitting on her bed, knees hugged to her chest. She looked up when Greg entered, and the fear in her eyes told him everything. She had heard. Greg crouched beside her. "Neela," he said gently, "was that your father?" She hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Greg felt something in his chest tighten. He needed to know, needed to understand why she feared him so much. "Can you tell me what happened, sweetheart?" Neela's breath shuddered. Then, in a voice so small it barely existed, she whispered, "He hurt me." Greg's jaw clenched. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed was like a knife twisting in his gut. Neela's small fingers gripped the blanket. He hurt Tala too. Greg's breath caught. Tala. Another name. Another child. His hands trembled. Who is Tala? Neela lifted her tear-filled eyes to his. My twin sister. Greg's vision blurred for a moment. You have a sister? He asked softly. She nodded. Greg felt like the room had tilted sideways. This changed everything. Where is she now, Neela? Tears spilled down Neela's cheeks. I don't know, she choked out. We ran away together. But we got separated. I couldn't find her. Greg exhaled, his chest aching. Neela, he said, gripping her small hands in his, we're going to find her. Neela looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. Really? Greg nodded firmly. I promise. A desperate call. The next morning, Greg wasted no time. He picked up his phone and called Sarah West, the social worker. Sarah, it's urgent, Greg said the moment she answered. Neela has a twin sister. She's still missing. There was a long pause. A twin? Sarah repeated. Yes, Greg confirmed. We need to find her. Now. Sarah exhaled. I'll do some digging. If she's been reported missing or taken into the system, I'll find out. Greg's grip on the phone tightened. And one more thing, Sarah. Yeah. Neela's father is looking for her. Silence. Then Sarah's voice dropped to a grave whisper. Greg, if Neela ran away from him, there's a reason. And if he's searching for her, it's not because he wants a happy reunion. Greg swallowed hard. I know. Be careful, Sarah warned. Greg's jaw tightened. I will. As he hung up, he turned toward the stairs. Neela was standing there, her small frame tense. Greg softened. We're going to find Tala, he promised. Neela took a step forward. And if he finds us first, she whispered. Greg's stomach twisted. Then, he said, voice firm, I won't let him take you. She studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. For the first time since she had come into his life, Greg saw it. Trust. But as the morning sun poured through the windows, a cold feeling settled in Greg's chest. Neela's father wasn't going to give up. And if they weren't careful, he was going to find them first. The hunt begins. Pastor Greg didn't sleep that night. Even after his conversation with Sarah, his mind wouldn't rest. The thought of Tala, Neela's twin sister, still out there, possibly alone, possibly in danger, gnawed at him like a persistent storm rolling over the horizon. And then there was the man, Neela's father. Greg's grip tightened on his coffee mug as he stared out the kitchen window. The street outside was still dark, streetlights flickering as the early morning mist curled along the pavement. A predator was out there, watching, waiting. Greg had been in the presence of darkness before. He had counseled addicts, prayed for criminals who came to the church seeking forgiveness, comforted victims of abuse. But Neela's father, there was something different about him. Something dangerous. Greg took a deep breath and turned back toward the stairs. He needed to keep his promise to Neela. They had to find Tala. A faint trail. By the time Neela woke up, Greg had already made 2 more calls, one to the police and another to a private investigator in town, an old friend named Jonathan Hayes. Jonathan wasn't just any investigator. He specialized in missing persons cases, and more importantly, he owed Greg a favor. Pastor, Jonathan greeted when he arrived later that morning, stepping inside and shaking the rain off his coat. It's been a while. Greg gave him a firm handshake. Too long. I wish this was a social visit, but I need your help. Jonathan took a seat at the kitchen table, setting down his leather-bound notebook. His sharp blue eyes flicked toward the small figure standing in the doorway, Neela. She was clutching the sleeve of her sweater, staring at the stranger with her usual guarded expression. Jonathan nodded toward her. This is the girl. Greg nodded. Neela. Sweetheart, this is my friend Jonathan. He's here to help us find your sister. Neela didn't respond at first. But then, slowly, she took a step forward. Jonathan softened his voice. "Hey there, kiddo. You're really brave. You know that." She hesitated, then looked up at Greg. "Can I trust him?" she asked quietly. Jonathan's eyebrows raised slightly, but he didn't seem offended. If anything, Greg saw a flicker of admiration. Greg crouched beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart. He's a good man, and he's going to help us find Tala." Neela stared at Jonathan for a long moment before finally giving a small nod. Jonathan leaned back, tapping his pen against the table. "All right, Neela. I know this is hard, but I need you to tell me everything you remember about the last time you saw your sister. Where were you? What happened?" Silence. Greg could feel Neela's body tense beside him. But then, slowly, she spoke. Neela's story. "It was raining," she said quietly, "like today." Greg and Jonathan remained silent, letting her continue at her own pace. "We had been running for a long time," Neela whispered. "We were hungry, tired. We stopped near a market to find food. But then," she swallowed hard. Jonathan leaned forward. "Take your time." Neela's hands balled into fists. "There were people. Lots of them. Tala said to stay close, but someone grabbed me." Greg stiffened. Jonathan frowned. "Someone grabbed you? Who?" "I don't know," Neela whispered. "It was a man. His hands were rough. He tried to pull me away." Greg felt his stomach twist. "And Tala?" Jonathan asked. Neela's breath hitched. "She screamed my name. She tried to fight him. But then the crowd got too big. I fell. And when I got up..." Her voice broke. She was gone. Greg closed his eyes for a moment, trying to suppress the emotions flooding his chest. He had known this story was going to be painful. Jonathan was already writing things down. "A crowded area. Possibly a marketplace," Jonathan muttered. "How long ago was this?" Neela hesitated. "Months." Jonathan exhaled. "That's a long time." Greg glanced at him. "But not impossible." Jonathan sighed. "Not impossible, but difficult. If she's still on the streets, it means she's either been moving around a lot, or..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Greg's chest tightened. "We're going to find her," he said firmly. Jonathan nodded. "I'll start by running her description through missing persons databases. If we get lucky, maybe she turned up somewhere. An orphanage, a shelter. Otherwise, we might need to start looking at street surveillance footage." Greg exhaled. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The warning comes too late. That afternoon, after Jonathan left, Greg took Neela to the church. He wanted to keep her mind occupied, wanted her to feel safe. But the moment they arrived, something felt off. The church door was slightly open. Greg's stomach dropped. He grabbed Neela's hand. "Stay behind me." Slowly, he pushed open the door. The sanctuary was empty. The stained glass windows cast colorful streaks of light along the wooden pews. Everything seemed untouched. But then, a single piece of paper lay on the altar. Greg's throat tightened as he approached. He picked it up, his hands slightly shaking. There were only 3 words. "She belongs to me." Greg's pulse thundered. A fresh wave of protectiveness surged through him. The man had been here. He was taunting them. Greg clenched his jaw and turned toward Neela, his protective instincts kicking into overdrive. "We're leaving," he said firmly. Neela looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "What happened?" Greg folded the note and stuffed it into his pocket. "Nothing," he lied. "But we need to be careful." He wasn't going to let that monster near her. Not now. Not ever. The chase begins. Back at home, Greg wasted no time. He picked up his phone and dialed Jonathan's number. "We have a problem," Greg said the moment Jonathan answered. Jonathan sighed. "What now?" Greg unfolded the note and read the message aloud. Silence. Then Jonathan cursed. That means he's been watching you. Jonathan muttered. You need to be on high alert. Lock your doors. Don't let Neela out of your sight. Greg clenched his jaw. I won't. Jonathan exhaled. I'll dig deeper. But Greg, this guy isn't just looking for her. He's hunting her. Greg's grip tightened on the phone. Then let's make sure we find her sister first, he growled. Before he does, a race against time. The message haunted him. She belongs to me. The words burned in Pastor Greg's mind like a fire he couldn't put out. Someone had been in his church. Someone had been watching. And the worst part, whoever had left that note had done it to send a clear message. They weren't going away. Greg stood at his kitchen counter, staring down at the folded note in his trembling hands. Neela sat at the table, her small fingers curled around a mug of warm cocoa, oblivious to the war raging inside him. For a moment, he just watched her. She looked so small, so fragile, and yet, he had seen the strength in her. She had survived things no child should ever have to endure. But she shouldn't have to survive anymore. She deserved to be safe. And if he had anything to say about it, he was going to make sure she never had to be afraid again. But first, he had to find Tala. Because if Neela's father was closing in, time was running out. The investigation deepens. Jonathan called the next morning. I have something. His voice was sharp, urgent. But you're not going to like it. Greg gripped the phone tighter. Tell me. Jonathan exhaled. I ran Tala's description through multiple databases. Nothing. No official reports. No records in any orphanages or foster care systems. It's like she disappeared into thin air. Greg swallowed hard. But Jonathan continued. I expanded the search radius. I checked local police reports, hospitals, shelters, and I found this. A rustling sound came through the phone before Jonathan sent over a photo. Greg opened the message. His heart nearly stopped. The image showed a blurry surveillance photo of a girl. She was standing outside a convenience store, bundled in a tattered hoodie that was way too big for her. She looked exhausted, thin, alone. But there was no doubt in Greg's mind. It was Tala. Greg sucked in a sharp breath. Where was this taken? About 40 miles from here, Jonathan said, near an abandoned bus station in a rough part of town. The store owner said she came in a few times over the past couple of weeks, looking for food, but she never stayed long. She always disappeared before anyone could talk to her. Greg's blood ran cold. She's still out there, he whispered. Jonathan's voice hardened. And if she's out there, it means he is too. Greg didn't need to ask who he meant. If Neela's father was already watching, it wouldn't be long before he figured out Tala was close. Which meant one thing. Greg had to get to her first. Neela's decision. Greg sat down across from Neela later that morning, his heart pounding. Nyla, sweetheart, we found something. She looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Tala, she whispered. Greg nodded. We think she's been seen near a store in another town. But she's been running, hiding, just like you were. Neela's small hands tightened around her mug. Greg hesitated, then gently asked, Would you come with me to look for her? For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, very slowly, she nodded. I want to find her, she whispered. Greg exhaled. Then we'll go today. But I need you to understand something, sweetheart. If your father is looking for you, we need to be careful. We can't let him find you. Neela's expression darkened. He won't, she whispered. There was steel in her voice. Greg nodded. Then let's go find your sister. A dangerous place. The drive was long, the roads winding through empty highways and forgotten buildings. Greg glanced at Neela, every so often in the rearview mirror. She was quiet, staring out the window as the world passed by. Her small fingers tapped against the door absent-mindedly. He knew she was nervous. They finally arrived in the part of town Jonathan had mentioned. Greg's stomach twisted the moment he parked the car. The place was rough. Graffiti-covered buildings, shattered windows, and abandoned alleyways stretched in every direction. A few people loitered around, eyes shifting with distrust. Greg immediately reached for Nila's hand, squeezing it. "Stay close to me," he said. She nodded. They walked toward the convenience store. The bell above the door jingled as Greg pushed it open. An older man stood behind the counter, eyeing them cautiously. Greg approached him. "Excuse me, sir. I'm looking for a girl. A young girl. About 10 years old. She looks like her." He gestured toward Nila. "Her name is Tala." The man's face darkened. "You the police?" "No," Greg said firmly. "I just want to help her." The man hesitated, then sighed. "She was here," he admitted. "A few days ago. She looked bad. Real bad. She grabbed a sandwich, and when I tried to ask her if she needed help, she bolted." Greg's stomach dropped. "Do you know where she went?" The man hesitated again. "Look," he said quietly, "you seem like a good guy, so I'll tell you this. If she's running, she's got a reason. People don't hide in places like this unless they're afraid of something worse." Greg's blood ran cold. "We need to find her," he said. The man sighed and pointed toward the back of the store. "Check the old bus station down the block. Some kids crash there sometimes." Greg nodded. He turned to Nila, his heart racing. "Ready?" She didn't even hesitate. "Yes." The bus station. The station was long abandoned, a skeleton of a place that once saw life. Greg's pulse quickened as they stepped inside. The smell of damp concrete and rust filled the air. Then, a rustling sound. Greg's head snapped toward the noise. And there, in the farthest corner of the station, a small figure crouched behind an old bench. Greg's heart stopped. "Nila," he whispered. Nila took a shaky step forward. Then, in a broken, tear-filled voice, she whispered, "Tala." The figure stilled. Then, slowly, a pair of identical brown eyes peeked out. And suddenly, the girl bolted. Greg reacted instantly. Wait. But Tala was fast. She sprinted toward the exit, her small feet barely touching the ground. Greg and Nila chased after her. "Tala!" Nila cried, desperation in her voice. Tala froze. Her shoulders trembled. Slowly, so slowly, she turned. Her wide, fearful eyes locked onto Nila's. "Nila," she whispered. Greg's breath caught. And in that moment, Tala finally saw. She saw her sister. She saw home. With a sob, she ran back, straight into Nila's waiting arms. The two girls collapsed onto the pavement, clinging to each other, their cries echoing through the empty station. Greg felt his throat tighten. They had found her. They had done it. But the moment was short-lived. Because just as Greg took a step toward them, a car engine roared nearby. A sleek, black SUV. Greg's heart nearly stopped. And then, a familiar figure stepped out. Cold, dark eyes. A cruel smirk. Nila's father. Greg's stomach plummeted. Because he knew this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The final stand. The world seemed to freeze. The cold air pressed against Pastor Greg's skin, but the real chill came from the man standing in front of him. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing. Nila's father. Greg's stomach twisted. The man's eyes flicked toward the two girls, still holding onto each other on the pavement. He smiled. A slow, calculated, predatory smile. "There you are," he said, his voice like gravel. Nila whimpered, gripping Tala tighter. Tala stiffened, her eyes darting wildly, looking for an escape. Greg instinctively stepped between them, his heart hammering. "You need to leave." The man chuckled. "That's cute, Pastor." He took a step forward. "You don't understand how this works." Greg clenched his fists. "I understand enough." The man exhaled through his nose. "You don't get it, do you? They're mine. Greg's blood boiled. They are not yours, he growled. You lost that right the moment you hurt them. Something dark flickered in the man's eyes. He didn't deny it. Instead, he took another step forward. Greg didn't move. The man let out a slow chuckle. You think you can stop me? Greg's breath was steady. His heart was not. But he stood firm. Yes. The man's jaw twitched. For the first time, something shifted in his face. Not fear, but frustration. Move, the man commanded. Greg didn't move an inch. The tension thickened, the air crackling like an approaching storm. Then, the black SUV door opened. Greg's breath caught. Another man stepped out. Bigger, meaner. 2 against 1. Greg's stomach twisted. This could go very, very badly. The girl's fear. Behind him, Nayla and Tala trembled. Tala's nails dug into Neela's arm. That's him, she whispered. Neela barely breathed. We have to run. Tala's eyes darted toward the alley. We can't leave him, Neela whispered, looking at Greg. Tala bit her lip. Then what do we do? Neela's mind raced. She had spent her whole life running. But now, for the first time, someone was standing for them. They couldn't leave him alone. Not now. Not ever. Neela swallowed hard, her heart pounding. We fight. A dangerous confrontation. The second man cracked his knuckles, stepping closer. Greg clenched his jaw. He knew he wasn't a fighter, but he also knew he wasn't letting these girls go. Not now. Not ever. I won't ask again, Pastor, Neela's father sneered. Move. No. The second man lunged. Greg barely had time to react before a fist slammed into his stomach. The pain was immediate. His breath hitched as he stumbled back, gasping for air. Greg, Neela screamed. Greg steadied himself, eyes burning with determination. The second man smirked, stepping forward. You should have listened. Greg's pulse pounded in his ears. He had to do something. Then, a scream. But not from Neela. From Tala. Everyone turned just in time to see the brick in her hand. And before the second man could react, she threw it. Hard. It hit him square in the face. The man staggered back, blood pouring from his nose. Greg's shock barely registered before another sound filled the air. Police sirens. Loud. Close. Fast. Greg's head snapped up. Across the street, a police car came speeding toward them, its lights flashing. Jonathan. He had called the cops. Greg's breath hitched in relief. Neela's father cursed under his breath. Then, without another word, he turned and ran. The second man stumbled after him, still clutching his bleeding face. The SUV screeched as it peeled away from the curb, tires burning against the asphalt. Gone. Just like that. Safety at last. Greg gasped, pressing a hand to his ribs. He wasn't sure if anything was broken, but he'd definitely feel it in the morning. Before he could say anything, Neela and Tala crashed into him. He winced but held them close. They were sobbing, shaking. But they were safe. Jonathan sprinted toward them, gun drawn, but the car was already disappearing down the road. Damn it, he muttered. Greg let out a shaky breath. They're gone. For now, Jonathan said grimly. But I got their plates. We'll find them. Greg closed his eyes. He didn't care about that right now. All he cared about was the 2 little girls in his arms. Jonathan knelt beside them, his voice softer. Hey, Nyla. Tala. You okay? Neela sniffled, her face buried in Greg's chest. Tala, still shaking, whispered, We're safe. Greg hugged them tighter. Yes, he murmured. You are. A new beginning. The next few days were a blur. The police officially launched an investigation. Neela's father's real name was finally revealed. He had a record, a long, violent one. He wasn't just a bad man. He was a monster. And now he was on the run. Greg knew it wasn't over, not completely. But he also knew Neela and Tala were finally safe. And then, a week later, the best news came. Greg sat them down at the kitchen table, taking a deep breath. "I have something to tell you," he said gently. Neela and Tala exchanged nervous glances. Greg smiled. "I want to adopt you." Silence. Complete, stunned silence. Neela's eyes filled with tears. You want us." Greg reached across the table, taking both their hands. "I already have you." His voice cracked. "But I want to make it forever." Tala broke first. She leaped forward, throwing her arms around his neck. Neela wasn't far behind. Greg held them both as they sobbed. This time, not out of fear, but out of hope. 1 year later, the sun was warm. The world was quiet. Neela and Tala sat on the porch, laughing over a book. Greg watched them, his heart full. 1 year ago, they had been running for their lives. Now, they were home. Neela glanced at Greg and smiled. "Hey, Dad." Greg blinked. It was the first time she had ever called him that. Tears burned his eyes. "Yeah, sweetheart." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you." Greg swallowed the lump in his throat. "You're welcome," he whispered. He had saved them. But in the end, they had saved him, too. He doesn't like loose ends. Jason's head spun. Lexington was dangerous, ruthless. If Mark was his problem now, Mark was dead. And Elizabeth had orchestrated it all. The trap snapped shut. Jason arrived at the mansion, just as Elizabeth was stepping out onto the grand balcony, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked unbothered. He stormed toward her. "What the hell did you do?" Elizabeth turned, raising a brow. "I fixed the problem." Jason's pulse pounded. "You had Lexington take him out." Elizabeth took a slow sip of her wine. "I had Lexington handle his own mess. Mark was his dog. And when a dog bites the wrong hand, what happens?" Jason stared at her. This wasn't the warm, gentle woman who had taken him in. This was Elizabeth Holloway, the woman who had built an empire. Jason exhaled sharply. "You knew this would happen." Elizabeth set her glass down, her gaze steady. "Jason, I've spent my life helping people, but I also know how to survive." Jason's jaw clenched. He had underestimated her. Elizabeth stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "You're free now. No more past chasing you. No more blackmail." Jason's mind whirled. Wasn't this what he wanted? To be free of Mark, to protect Elizabeth. But not like this. Not like a hit had been ordered. He ran a hand through his hair. "Elizabeth, I don't know if I can." She reached for his hand. "Jason." He looked at her, and in that moment, he saw everything. Elizabeth had always been in control. She had always been 3 steps ahead. She had played the game better than him. And now she was giving him a choice. Walk away. Or stay. Jason swallowed hard. "I love you," Elizabeth said, her voice quiet. "But I will always protect what's mine." Jason's heart pounded. What's mine? She meant him to. His past was erased, his mistakes forgiven. But at what cost? Jason took a slow breath. Then, finally, he made his choice. The final decision. Jason stayed. Not because he was afraid. Not because he had no other options. But because Elizabeth had saved him in every way possible. And maybe, just maybe, he had always been meant for this world after all.